Most enterprise AI pilots fail for one of two reasons. Either the organization starts too small and learns nothing operationally, or it rolls out AI too broadly before governance, workflow controls, and review processes are in place. In this video, we'll walk through a practical approach for launching a Claude Cowork pilot for approximately 10 to 25 users inside a medium to large business. This is the first in an 8-part series that I'm going to do on Cowork pilot implementations. In this episode, we'll cover the strategy and the charter, the foundational decisions that make every later phase easier or harder. We'll address why a Cowork pilot is structurally different from a chat tool pilot, why the right unit of measurement is workflows rather than users, and how to define a pilot charter that gives governance, security, and operational leadership a shared reference document. This is not a hype video, and I'm not connected to Claude in any way. This is a practical enterprise implementation discussion intended for business leaders, governance owners, and the operational teams responsible for getting AI into production responsibly. In future series, we'll look at other tools, but in this series, I'm going to focus on Claude Cowork. Before we discuss pilot mechanics, it's worth being precise about what Cowork actually is and why piloting it is not the same problem as piloting a chat-based AI assistant. Claude Cowork is a desktop agent. It runs on macOS and Windows. It can read files, draft documents, operate browsers, control specific applications, and execute multiple-step workflows. With Dispatch, it can run those workflows persistently, returning to a task after hours or across sessions. With computer use, it can take direct action inside other applications on the user's machine. That capability set introduces 3 governance dimensions that a chat pilot doesn't have. First, autonomous action. The agent can do things, not just suggest things. That changes the review model. Second, connectors and plugins. Cowork integrates with the organization's other systems through MCP connectors and through a plugin marketplace. Each connection is a data pathway that needs to be approved. Third, persistent operation. Scheduled tasks and dispatch mean workflows can execute without an active user session. A workflow running unattended is a different governance object than a prompt typed by a person. If your pilot framework only addresses what the user sees on screen, it is incomplete for Cowork. The pilot has to account for what the agent does, what it connects to, and when it runs. One of the most common mistakes is evaluating enterprise AI with just 1 or 2 isolated users. That produces anecdotes, but not operational evidence. The other failure mode is actually the opposite. Rolling out before governance is operational, which generates exposure faster than it generates insight. A pilot group of approximately 10 to 25 users is large enough to test multiple workflow categories simultaneously, surface governance gaps under realistic load, observe adoption patterns across role types, and generate enough telemetry to be meaningful. But the number that actually matters in a Cowork pilot is not user count, it's workflow count. A 15-user pilot that tests 3 workflows produces less operational insight than a 12-user pilot that tests 8 workflows across 4 departments. The user count establishes the scale. The workflow catalog establishes the value of the data. When you size your pilot, size both: the number of participants and the number of approved workflow categories they will exercise. We'll address the workflow catalog in detail in episode 5. Before giving access to anyone, the organization needs a written pilot charter. The charter can be just a 1-page document that lists the decisions leadership has already made so that the pilot team is not relitigating them in week 3. A pilot charter for Cowork should specify 5 things. First, scope. Which workflows are in scope, which departments are participating, and what duration will the pilot run? 6 to 12 weeks is typical. Anything shorter does not produce reliable adoption data. Anything longer drifts into uncontrolled deployment. Second, exclusions. Which data classifications are prohibited from being processed? Which applications are out of scope for computer use? Which connectors are not approved for the pilot phase? These exclusions are operational, not aspirational. They should be enforced through RBAC and connector controls, not through trust. Third, decision rights. Who approves a new workflow? Who approves a new plugin or connector? Who can override an exclusion in an exceptional case? Naming these roles in the charter prevents the decisions from defaulting to whoever happens to be in the room. Fourth, success criteria. The charter should specify what the pilot is intended to demonstrate in measurable terms, not evaluate Cowork's potential. That's not a criterion. Something closer to reduce average time on task for the three named workflows by a measurable amount against a pre pilot baseline with no governance violations. We'll address measurement frameworks in episode 7. Fifth, the go no go decision authority. Who decides at the end of the pilot whether the organization scales, redesigns, or stops? The charter should name that role and the date the decisions will be made. A pilot charter signed by legal, security, IT, and the business sponsor before week 1 is the single document that prevents the most common pilot failure, the pilot that runs to completion without anyone being authorized to act on its findings. Cowork governance rests on 4 pillars. Each one needs an explicit pilot phase decision. Data governance. What data classifications may be processed, what may not, and what happens at the boundary. For regulated industries, this is where HIPAA, GLBA, or SOX requirements gets translated into specific pilot phase prohibitions. The AUP, the acceptable use policy for the pilot, is the operational document where this lives. Action governance. What the agent may do autonomously, what requires confirmation, and what is prohibited entirely. Computer use is the highest stakes category here. A pilot can permit read-only computer use, action-capable computer use, or restrict computer use entirely. That decision should be deliberate. Identity governance. Role-based access controls were a key part of the April 2026 GA release. Pilot RBAC design should distinguish between administrators, reviewers, practitioners, and executive observers with different connectors and plug-in permissions for each. Per-tool connector controls let you scope this granularly. Observability governance. Pilots need to know what happened, not just what users thought happened. The Enterprise Analytics API provides structured telemetry. Open Telemetry Export integrates that telemetry with the organization's existing observability stack. Group spend limits give you a cost ceiling that doubles as an anomaly signal. Governance is not a blocker for the pilot. Governance is the infrastructure that makes a pilot interpretable. A pilot without governance produces data that organizations can't defend, justify, or act on. The cohort should be designed, not volunteered. Enthusiasm is not a selection criteria. Operational realism is. A 15 to 25 person cohort typically includes operational practitioners who do the daily work, analytical users who consolidate and report, leadership stakeholders who observe and decide, and at least one representative each from IT, security, and the business owner of the pilot. The cohort should branch into 2 operational tracks. Executive observers participate to understand what the pilot is generating. They do not need full computer use access. Operational practitioners are the people doing the real work with the agent. They need full access and the corresponding training. One role is non-optional. Every pilot needs a pilot champion, typically a respected mid-level operator, not an executive, whose job is to run office hours, surface workflow problems early, and act as the bridge between the pilot users and the governance team. Pilots without a named champion drift. Pilots with a strong champion produce findings that are credible to both governance and to operations. Cohort composition is also where industry specificity starts mattering. An insurance pilot might mix underwriting, claims, and actuarial. A healthcare pilot might mix clinical operations, revenue cycle, and compliance. A financial services pilot might mix portfolio operations, client reporting, and risk. We'll address industry-specific variants in dedicated episodes. We'll dedicate an entire episode to measurement frameworks, but at the charter stage, 3 principles need to be in place. First, measure against a baseline. Before the pilot begins, instrument the workflows you intend to test. Time on task, error rate, throughput, review cycles. Without a baseline, the pilot can only produce subjective comparisons. Second, separate leading indicators from lagging indicators. Leading indicators such as adoption rate, workflow completion rate, review pass rate tell you whether the pilot is functioning. Lagging indicators such as time savings, error reduction, throughput improvement can tell you whether it's producing value. Both matter, but they don't arrive at the same time. Third, use the telemetry the platform already provides. The Enterprise Analytics API and the Open Telemetry Export are not optional features. They are the structured data layer the pilot review depends on. If your pilot is collecting metrics through self-user reports and screenshots, The data will not survive scrutiny. 5 mistakes account for most of Cowork pilot failures. Treating the pilot as a software deployment instead of an operational process change. The technology is the smaller half of the work. Skipping the charter and starting with access provisioning. Pilots without a charter drift, and pilots that drift cannot be scaled. Choosing volunteers instead of designing the cohort. Volunteer cohorts produce over-optimistic findings that do not generalize. Letting computer use default to permissive. Computer use is the highest stakes capability in the platform and deserves an explicit pilot phase scoping decision. And measuring through self-report instead of telemetry. The Analytics API exists for a reason. A well-run Cowork pilot avoids these mistakes by making each decision deliberately, in writing, before week 1. A successful Cowork pilot is not defined by how impressive the demonstrations are. It's defined by whether the organization learns how its governance will operate, how its workflow should be structured, where the risks appear in practice, and what operational support is required before broader deployment. For most medium and large-size organizations, a controlled 10 to 25 user pilot, scoped to a specific workflow catalog, and run against a written charter, generates the operational evidence required to make a defensible scale decision. In the next 7 episodes of this series, we'll address each component in detail. Episode 2 covers the governance foundation, including the acceptance use policy and data classification. Episode 3 covers technical setup, RBAC, and connector policy. Episode 4 covers cohort design. Episode 5 builds the approved workflow catalog. Episode 6 addresses training and enablement. Episode 7 goes deep on measurement. Episode 8 covers the scale decision itself. If your organization is evaluating Cowork seriously, the operational details addressed in this series will matter far more than any demonstrations. Thanks for watching, and if you're considering a Claude Cowork pilot at your organization, subscribe to this channel and hit the notification icon so you'll know when the next video in this series is released. And if you're ready for a practical place to start, I have several guides, including a newly released Claude Cowork pilot playbook available for purchase. Visit cahillnet.com for guides, bundles, SCORM courses, and more. Until next time.